Shalom Aleichem, good morning. It is Isru Chag of Simchas Teire, Hey Tov Shin Pei Gimel. It's Thursday, Chav Hey Tishrei. And I want to mention that today is the Yhartzeit of the Heilig Berditchever, who was a dear friend of the Alter Rebbe. He was a Gon and a Gadol and a Kaddish and a Tzaddik, whose Torah is quoted in Chassidus Chabad more than once or twice. Not a lot of Talmidei HaMaggid are quoted, and certainly not more than once. And he was Alter Rebbe's Machon. Alter Rebbe's Machon. They had grandchildren married to one another. One of the most unusual things about the relationship between the Alter Rebbe and the Berditchever is the fact that when he was nostalgic, the Alter Rebbe traveled all the way to Berditchev to Menachem of his almana, which was a great distance. It was a considerable distance. Alter Rebbe was living at that time in Liadi, which is in Russia, and Berditchev is someplace in the Ukraine. And the Alter Rebbe traveled to Menachem Avil. And one of the more interesting stories, Rabbi Shia Munchain has a whole book, I guess he calls it Masa Ha'acharein, where he collects all kinds of anecdotes about this trip, that the almon of the Berditchever set me very from a Pesach. Who's going to make me a Seder? And the Alter Rebbe said, I will. And the Alter Rebbe spent that winter in the Ukraine, and he came back to Berditchev and made Pesach for the almon of the Heilig Berditchever. The Berditchever was a Litvak, as was the Alter Rebbe, which meant A, he was in a stronghold of the Misnagdim, and B, that in addition to his avoida and his chassidus and his tzidkes, he was also a gon amiti and nigla, a gon olam. And he held a rabbonis in Pinsk, which was one of the most prominent Litvische cities. You know, the most important Litvische city was Vilna, and then there was Shklov. Now what comes after Shklov? There was Minsk and there was Pinsk. I don't know if Pinsk was the fourth, but it was a very prominent rabbonis. And the Berditchever was such a powerful personality because of his lumdus, that as much as the city was dominated by the Misnagdim, his position was secure. Until he left, he went off to a meeting in Volin, presumably Tovkuf Mem Gimel, Tovkuf Mem Daled, that would be the 1780s. And when he was gone, they literally threw his family out of town. They They packed up their bags, put them in wagons, and shipped them out. The same Avigdor, who 15 years on would stand against the Alter Rebbe when the Alter Rebbe was arrested the second time. As you may know or may not know, the first time the Alter Rebbe was arrested, we don't know till this day who was responsible for it. The man who wrote the libels which got the Alter Rebbe arrested was Hirsch ben Baruch in Vilna. Ada Yom Hazeh, nobody knows who Hirsch ben Baruch is, but the first time the Alter Rebbe was arrested, although he was taken like a common prisoner, the previous Rebbe writes, it looked worse, but it actually wasn't as bad as the second arrest, which looked better, because the government was asking him questions without knowing why they were asking him the questions. They didn't know what the opposition was. The second time, the Alter Rebbe was treated much more properly and respectfully. He wasn't held in a jail cell, he was held in government accommodations, but he was up against Avigdor Pinsky, the Rav of Pinsk, who was a big Talmid Chacham and a big Misnagid. And in the literature, in the cross-examination documents, which are now all published, he's called Chaimovich, Ben Chaim, just like the Alter Rebbe is called Ben Baruch, Baruchovich. His father's name was Chaim, Avigdor, and he was the Rav in Pinsk. He threw the Berditchever out and took his position. Chassidim claim that this Avigdor later in life became a shikir, became a drunk, and he would come in this Kislev and ask for a drink and claim that because of him they had this Yom Tov. It's a nice story. Is it true? I don't know, but I've heard it as a Kol Chayzer, a voice which seems to have some kind of a resonance, but I don't know. It's just curious if it's not going to become bigger or smaller, whether this is or isn't true. But the Berditchever was thrown out of Pinsk. Now, from non-Chabad sources, I heard from my Rabbi Reuben, so Hamalichting Gan Eden, the Berditchever was kicked out of Pinsk. He had a great nefilas haruach. It was devastating to him. And for a period of time, I don't know how long, he was withdrawn physically because he was withdrawn spiritually. And if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Reuben told me he was living in Koznitz, by the Hilka Koznitz and Magid, Rabbi Saul of Koznitz. And that one Shabbos, this is how I heard the story from Rabbi Reuben. I'm repeating the story as I heard it from him, although a story which doesn't have a Chabad source. The Rebbe says Gehet from Shver, heard from the previous Rebbe, is a nice story, but it's hard to know whether the stories are true or not. But that the one Shabbos, the Kodesh HaMagid was the Baal Tefillah. The Kodesh HaMagid happened for the Yomid always. He was the Chazan for all the Tefillahs. And Shabbos morning, when he was saying Yismach Moshe b'matnas Chelkei, instead of saying Yismach Moshe, he said Yismach Levi Yitzchok b'matnas Chelkei. And this Tefillah, this is the story he told me, pulled the Berditchever out of his Katnas Machon and gave him back his Machon, made him back who he was. And he moved from Koznitz to Berditchev, and he opened up a shop, and he became a good rebbe. But the tragedy with the Berditchever was that it was no hemshech, right? He was a tzaddik, a godel, a kodesh, but he didn't have a dynasty. He was a dynasty, but he didn't have a dynasty. Until this day, he's considered Sanigorian Shel Yisrael. Just mentioning his name, Levi Yitzchok Berditchever. I think the Rebbe once said you have to say his name completely. Harav Levi Yitzchok Berditchev is a good advocacy for the Jewish people, especially coming now from Yom Tov and from Simchas Torah. And certainly the Eibishter gave everybody a good year. Bebracha, or bebrias, or besimcha, or behatzlacha, or bemenucha, or b'shol, or b'arachov, alle gute Sachen, bebonach chayim, mezein reviche, bekolim reviche. The fact that his Yhartzeit comes so close to Yom Tov. If you look at it from the angle of Peilish Tzadikim, it simply extends the Yom Tov. You know that the Peilish Tzadikim consider the Yhartzeit simcha. The halacha is that a Yhartzeit is a yom tainus, you fast. And Chabad falls someplace in the middle. That on the one hand we call it a histalkas, a hilula, but on the other hand, not to say tachnan, Chafei Tishrei, you never say tachnan anyway, because it's the end of Chedesh Tishrei. But as a Yhartzeit, we do say tachnan. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, said publicly once that he asked the previous Rebbe about not saying tachnan on a Yhartzeit, and the previous Rebbe told him, "When then is da besser tag zogen tachnan," which means basically there's no better day to say tachnan than on a Yhartzeit. Meaning a Yhartzeit is a seminary, it's an Yisratz. V'achayit and a libe, it's an inyan from tshuva. Anytime you are aware of the inyan of the opposite of life, especially by tzaddikim, it wakes us, it sobers up to the seriousness and the awesomeness of life and the preciousness of each moment and our service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we don't make a Yhartzeit into a Yom Tov, we make a Yhartzeit into a day of Chassidus, of tshuva, although we do not fast on a Yhartzeit, as the halacha is. But the Berditchever, so for the Peilish, certainly this is an extension of Simchas Torah, it's a Yom Tov. And in Chabad we anyway have Yom Tov till Zayin Cheshvan, as the Rebbe Kedarkei B'Kodesh has found a way of extending Sukkot by 2 more weeks. In any case, mentioning the Berditchever is a schus for all of us. I don't know if he needs our schus, but we certainly need his. Especially, like I said before, he was so close to Rabbi Seidus, he was so close to our Rebbeim. He defended the Alter Rebbe against all comers. Baal Peh and B'Ksav, there's a letter from the Berditchever where he writes in defense of the Alter Rebbe. He wrote in that letter that what you're teaching, what I'm teaching, I don't know, but what he's teaching, and if I'm not mistaken, in that letter he refers to the Alter Rebbe, who was his friend and younger than him by a few years, Admur. What he's teaching, this is Divrei Elokim Chaim, from what we heard from our Rebbe in the Mizitcher Magid, and he therefore objects to the people who are objecting to the Derech of Chabad of the Alter Rebbe. There's a story that's told also about Peh, that he met a Baruch Mezhebush, who was a strong critic of the Hilik of the Alter Rebbe, and the Berditchever said to him, "What do you want from the Alter Rebbe?" Ich hab gehet leinen. I heard him reading the Torah. Und has given kulei lamailo, und it oiskeloch ken ein tag lamata. He was completely in the heavens, and didn't miss a single crown of a letter in the way he read it down here on earth, according to the criteria of halacha and nigla and pshat and pashtas. So we're mentioning his name at the beginning of the shir. Today says Yhartzeit.